Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 3967 as amended, the Honoring Our PACT Act of 2021. When we sent our service members into harm's way, we made a pact to care for them when they came home. But for far too long, Congress and the Department of Veterans Affairs have been slow to accept responsibility and cost of that care, citing high costs or lack of absolute scientific proof of illness connections to service. The result is a disability claims process that is cumbersome and one that places the burden of proof for toxic exposure on veterans themselves. Every day, more and more veterans speak out about exposure to environmental hazards and other toxic substances during their military service. Recently, I put out a call encouraging toxic-exposed veterans to share their experiences with the House Veterans Committee. We heard from thousands of veterans in 49 states. These reflections are very powerful, and I'd like to share some of them with you now. Navy veteran Ed described how toxic exposures overwhelmed his senses. He wrote, quote, "You could not escape the jet fuel. You could see it, smell it, and taste it," end quote. I heard from veteran Mike, who said, quote, "Even when we weren't actively engaged in dumping items into the burn pit, we were still exposed," end quote. Air Force veteran Christopher R. described his dealings with VA, stating, quote, "I continue to be rejected because they say that it's impossible to prove that it is service-related. I never worked with chemicals before my service or since. I feel like a nuisance to the VA health system," end quote. I heard from the widow of Army veteran Austin Monk, who said, quote, "No wife should have to bury her 22-year-old husband because of his exposure to unsafe conditions while in service to his country," end quote. These stories are heart-wrenching and frustrating. Our veterans are fighting their own government to grant them the care and benefits they've earned. We should be outraged listening to these stories, and it should be clear how urgent passing the Honoring Our PACT Act is for our veterans. Veterans and veteran service organizations agree. I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, to enter the letters of support from more than 42 veteran service organizations into the record.
Without objection.
So I wish to thank Nancy Pelosi, our Speaker, for her commitment to bring this bill to the floor. After years of diligent input from my colleagues, our staff, VA, VSOs, and toxic-exposed veterans themselves, I'm confident that we are bringing the best possible version of this bill up for a vote. The administration agrees and has stated that it, quote, "strongly supports," end quote, this legislation. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to enter the Statement of Administrative Policy for H.R. 3967 into the record.
Without objection.
Well, it is now time for the members of this body to answer a simple question. Am I willing to support our troops and honor our nation's promise to them? This bill addresses the true cost of war, and opposing it would be a vote against our service members and veterans. Such a vote would be inconsistent with the thank yous and patriotic displays so many of my colleagues offer on Veterans Day. Veterans want action, and they deserve our action. We made a promise to deliver comprehensive toxic exposure legislation, and I intend to keep that promise. The Honoring Our PACT Act will address the full scope of issues affecting toxic-exposed veterans' access to VA care and benefits while reforming VA's presumptive decision-making process. It will expand VA healthcare eligibility for over 3.5 million veterans exposed to burn pits and establish a presumption of service connection for over 23 respiratory illnesses and cancers. There is no other toxic exposure legislation in Congress like this one, in scope or in soundness. Before I close, I must emphasize something essential. We cannot renege on our responsibility to toxic exposed veterans because of any perceived sticker shock. Cries for offsets and pay-fors did not stop Congress from passing a $1.9 trillion tax cut for corporations and the wealthy in 2017. Over the past 20 years, Congress and our country made the choice to spend trillions on other priorities while sending service members into harm's way at the cost of $6.4 trillion. We know that this Congress is willing to find money when it wants to, as it recently demonstrated by adding $25 billion to the last National Defense Authorization Act. And when our country goes to war, we don't nickel and dime the Department of Defense. And we shouldn't try to pinch pennies when it comes to covering the care for toxic exposed veterans. We will not stand by and be lectured about fiscal responsibility when we have a moral obligation to America's veterans. And the time to meet that obligation is now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to H.R. 3967, the PACT Act. I wish that this were not the case. I would love to be here today, standing proud alongside Chairman in support of this bill. I know Ranking Member Bost would as well. I am new to Congress, but I understand that historically, the VA committee would work on a bipartisan basis to advance legislation of this magnitude. The Mission Act and the Forever GI Bill are wonderful examples of the majority and minority in the House and Senate working together in prior Congresses on a compromise that both sides could support and send to the President's desk. That's how Congress should work. That's why they used to say that those of us on the VA committee would leave our party affiliations at the door and that the VA committee was the most bipartisan committee in Congress. That is no longer the case under this Democrat majority. The PACT Act is a sad example of that. My fellow Republicans and I want to work with the majority to create fair and consistent pathway for health care benefits for toxic exposed veterans. This is an issue we care deeply about, for which I have a personal association and have made our top priority in the 117th Congress. But the majority has consistently refused to meaningfully communicate with us on this bill. In fact, the majority significantly rewrote major portions and components of the PACT Act less than 2 weeks ago and refused to even discuss those changes with those of us in the minority. Because we did not work together to resolve our differences, the bill has serious flaws that we were unable to resolve. Already, the manager's amendment would expand benefits to more veterans without scientific justification, showing just how slippery a slope this bill would set. As an alternative, I support creating a fair and consistent process for the VA to decide whether benefits are warranted for certain military toxic exposure events. VA should base this decision on a criteria that weighs the strength of scientific evidence supporting a link between the development of a condition and toxic exposure. In fact, for the past 2 years during the pandemic, we have heard repeatedly from the opposite side about following the science. If the VA determines that there is at least 50% chance that these veterans' disabilities are linked to toxic exposure, then VA should grant benefits on a presumptive basis. The PACT Act attempts to create such a framework, but I believe more discussion is needed to determine if it's the best path forward. That is especially important since the VA began piloting its own program for deciding whether there is a scientific link between a disability and toxic exposure last year. Under VA's model, certain Gulf War and post-9/11 veterans who were exposed to airborne hazards and developed asthma, sinusitis, rhinitis became eligible for benefits last September. And just this past week, VA announced it will provide compensation to certain veterans who are diagnosed with 9 rare respiratory cancers. VA's decisions were based on science. However, It's unclear if all the conditions under Chairman Takano's bill would meet the scientific threshold under his framework or under the VA's. Furthermore, the PACT Act could also flood VA with so many new mandates that veterans already receiving care and benefits wait longer. Veterans wait too long for VA services right now. I hear frequently from veterans in Iowa who can't get the care they need, are waiting months, and in some states, even years for the benefits they've earned. I don't know of a member in this body who can't say the same thing. Making those veterans wait even longer is unacceptable, and it could be unprecedented where claims process is concerned. In 2013, the disability claims backlog peaked at 600,000 pending claims. Veterans were waiting years to receive an initial decision of their claim, and then if it was denied, they were waiting even longer while the VA processed their appeal. VA has made some improvements to how disability claims are processed since 2013, but the department is still years away from developing the information technology needed to truly expedite claims processing. If the PACT Act were enacted, VA estimates the disability claims backlog could reach over 1.5 million claims by the end of fiscal year 2023. That's more than double the height of the backlog in 2013. If veterans were waiting years for their benefits 9 years ago, imagine how long they would have to wait today for a backlog that is more than 2 times the size it was then. That is completely unreasonable. The PACT Act is also unacceptable for taxpayers. CBO estimates the PACT Act would require over $300 million in new government spending. Not a penny of those costs are offset. Additionally, some of the amendments we will be voting on would increase the cost by millions of dollars in new mandatory spending on top of that. You will hear some say that this is just the cost of war. Anyone who has served or has a loved one who serves, like I have and do, know what war costs. They also know that veterans pay taxes too. They also know that veterans have children and grandchildren whose futures they don't want to be any more burdened with debt than they already are. The PACT Act cost more than combined discretionary budgets of 9 cabinet-level departments. Think about that. And then think about inflation and our national debt, which is already skyrocketing and is causing American taxpayers to pinch pennies. We are not doing right by our veterans by being fiscally irresponsible in their name. And I say that as a veteran myself. Finally, there is no clear or quick path forward in the Senate for the PACT Act. In comparison, we could send legislation to the President's desk today that would help sick veterans get the care they need. The Healthcare for Burn Pit Veterans Act would let toxic, exposed, post-9/11 combat veterans enroll in the VA healthcare system. It is bipartisan, and it has already passed the Senate last month. I understand the majority would like to go to conference over the Healthcare for Burn Pit Veterans Act and the PACT Act. But I also understand that the majority supports the Healthcare for Burn Pit Veterans Act because they included it as a provision in the Rules Committee print of the PACT Act. If we all agree that the Healthcare for Burn Pit Veterans Act is a good policy, why would we delay its enactment? Every day that the House fails to send it to the President is another day that veterans are deprived of life-saving care. Nothing could be more wrong-headed than that. The Healthcare for Burn Pit Veterans Act is the correct first step towards this process. If we deliver needed health care to toxic, exposed veterans and buy us the time to work on a bipartisan, bicameral basis to deliver other benefits and services to them down the line, they would at least have health care now. We should have done this throughout this congressional session, but we haven't even started yet. Sick veterans should not pay the price for our inaction. Rather than pass the PACT Act in the House, with its many flaws and its extremely high likelihood of dying in the Senate, we must pass the Healthcare for Burn Pit Veterans Act today. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, it is my honor and privilege to yield 1 minute to a person who has done more for veterans more for veterans in modern times than any other leader of this body. I proudly yield 1 minute to Speaker Pelosi.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, for his kind words, which I accept on behalf of our working in a bipartisan way for our Democrats, for our veterans over the years, Democrats and Republicans. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your extraordinary leadership, both in this case and earlier for our veterans, whether it was completing our Agent Orange responsibilities to our veterans as well. I thank Congressman Ruiz, a doctor and a member of Congress who has been a champion on this issue, and Elaine Lauria, a veteran and a member of Congress who has been so instrumental in bringing this legislation to the floor. When the President spoke last night about meeting the needs of our veterans, when it came to the burn pits, he received almost a unanimous standing ovation for that. And it was very encouraging to see the Congress of the United States, House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, recognize their obligation to our men and women in uniform. It's important to note that over the past generation, over 3 million of our courageous Americans have answered the call to serve and have donned the uniform to protect our freedoms as heroic Americans, as just as people have done since our founding. From the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, I was hearing this morning about Kandahar, and on bases and military theaters around the world, these heroes have risked their lives to fight the enemy, and yet tragically have had to face another deadly threat due to exposure to burn pits and other toxic substances. We always say about our military, on the battlefield we leave no soldier behind, and when they come home, we leave no veteran behind. We want them, instead of receiving comprehensive, timely care and benefits, sometimes they are forced to confront a disability claims process that is nearly impossible to navigate. That is why the honoring our promise to address Comprehensive Toxic Act, the PACT Act, finally faithfully fulfills that pledge now into the future, that we will leave no veteran behind. The budget cost of it are a cost of war. When we decide that we need to engage and initiate a military action, we should understand that the cost is not just in our defense budget, but also in our veterans' budget when they come home. Frankly, the cost of this bill is a fraction, if we're talking budget, of the cost of the Republican tax bill that they passed in 2017, which added $2 trillion to the national debt. I didn't hear anybody complaining about, on the other side of the aisle, about what that was, the impact that had on veterans and their concerns about the fiscal soundness of the United States. So let's just put to rest, if it is a cost that we must have for our veterans, and this has been thoroughly researched and others will speak to that, then we cannot say we can't afford it. It isn't about the price, it's about the value of what we get for this. And so in the last 20 years, VA has seen over 60% increase in rates of cancer due to toxic exposure. 86% of veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan report being exposed to the toxic fumes of burn pits. And 88% of those exposed said they were experiencing symptoms that could be related to that. Potentially up to 3.5 million veterans deployed post 9/11 may have been exposed to toxic fumes and substances. Despite this reality, nearly 75% of burn pit-related disability claims were denied, Mr. Speaker, were denied. Too often, VA and Congress have said it's just too expensive to care for, and there just isn't enough proof. The result of this negligence has been tragic. Thousands of veterans and families have been forced to suffer, including heroes, like one I will quote, Staff Sergeant Wesley Black. Staff Sergeant Black was a Purple Heart hero who survived 2 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. In November, he died at age 36 from colon cancer tied to toxic exposure from burn pits, leaving behind his wife and new baby. After serving his country with distinction, Sergeant Black should have been able to retire happily with pride. Instead, he spent his final days fighting for the reforms contained in this legislation so that no current or future veteran would be forced to endure the same horror that he and his family did. He said before his passing, he said, Staff Sergeant Wesley Black said, "It's too late for me, but it's not too late for the next veteran who walks down the hall of VA and goes in and complains about signs and symptoms. We must make sure it's not too late for other veterans," I say, and when we send our servicemen and women into harm's way, we care for them when they come home. This is particularly important to me because a long time ago, long before I was in Congress, 1981, I went and sat with veterans in California with Dick Gregory, who was making a big association with the cause for Agent Orange. 1981, California, veterans having a hunger strike. Dick Gregory knew about hunger strikes from the civil rights movement, and he was associating himself with them, instructing them on how to survive a hunger strike, and I had the privilege of being with them. Little did I know at that time it would take decades to address their Agent Orange concerns. And it wasn't even complete until Mr. Takano, Mr. Chairman, did so with the naval legislation that he passed, the Navy legislation that he passed. We cannot let that much time go by. That would be shameful to our country. So again, let us also thank Mr. Cartwright, who also included in this package the Camp Lejeune Justice Act. Anyone who has heard from those families coming from Camp Lejeune, not just the service member, but their family members who have been damaged related to injuries incurred while serving at Camp Lejeune. The list goes on. So again, thank you, Chairman Takano. Thank you, Congressman Raul Ruiz. Thank you, Elaine Loria. Thank you, Matt Cartwright. Thank you all who have worked so hard to bring this to the floor. And I want to also salute Chairman Tester in the Senate, with whom Chairman Takano and our committee have worked closely. We share a goal. We have to find the complete package so that it is comprehensive and fulfills our responsibilities. Others will go into the particulars of it. I want to also salute the distinguished Secretary of VA, Dennis McDonough, for the attention that he has paid to making sure what we do honors the promise of the PACT Act, that it is able to deliver in a timely fashion, so that the bill is written in a way that delivers in a timely fashion to our veterans. I could not have been more excited when the President of the United States included this important initiative in his remarks, not only as legislation, but in the larger issue of what it means to our country, how we value our veterans, and how we want to pass this legislation and get it to his desk soon, so it will be a comfort to our veterans and their families, that on the battlefield, we leave no soldier behind, and when they come home, we leave no veterans behind. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I could not agree more that we can act today and we can forward legislation to the desk of the President for his signature by passing the Healthcare for Burn Pit Veterans Act today, so that there is not another Sergeant Wesley Black who is denied health care while the VA processes his claims. And we would be more than delighted to help the President in honoring his initiative, as he stated last night in the State of the Union, by today passing the Healthcare for Burn Pit Veterans Act. I yield back and reserve my time.
Gentlewoman from Iowa reserves. The gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my good friend who serves as the chair of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity. The gentleman from California, Chairman Mike Levin.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chairman Takano, for your leadership. I rise today in strong support of the Honoring Our PACT Act. All too often, many veterans hear the words, "Thank you for your service," but don't see enough action behind those words. Sadly, that's been true for millions of veterans who were exposed to toxic substances during their service and are now suffering from related health conditions. While they defended our country, they were exposed to burn pits, PFAS chemicals, and more, but we've failed to hold up our end of the bargain to care for them when they return home. In the case of Vietnam veterans, many who were exposed to Agent Orange were forced to wait for more than 40 years before they saw proper benefits. For too long, the burden of proof has been on the veteran to show that their illness is a result of toxic exposure they experienced during their service. For too long, veterans have been told that it's too expensive to cover the range of health issues that they have as a result of their toxic exposure. That's wrong, and we must do better for our veterans. With the Honoring Our PACT Act, we can do right by our veterans. This includes finally presuming that if they were exposed to toxic substances during their service and are now experiencing one of 23 respiratory illnesses and cancers, then that illness is as a result of their exposure, and they are owed proper access to benefits and care through the VA. I also want to highlight what I hope will become a key piece of this bill, an amendment I offered to authorize federal grants for county veteran service officers who help veterans and their families understand resources at their disposal, file benefit claims, and represent veterans in VA hearings. County veteran service officers are often veterans' best allies in navigating red tape within the VA and securing the benefits that veterans have earned, which will be particularly important for the 3.5 million veterans who may be eligible for new benefits and care as a result of this legislation. The amendment is similar to my Commitment to Veteran Support and Outreach Act, which I introduced with a bipartisan group last year, and I hope to see it move forward as part of the Honoring Our PACT Act today. As I said, this legislation is our opportunity to put real action behind our words. Saying, "Thank you for your service," has never been enough. It's time to fulfill the promises we've made to our troops and invest in the care and benefits they deserve. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes, and I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa.
I reserve.
Gentlewoman from Iowa reserves. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I yield 1 minute to the esteemed Majority Leader of this House, Steny Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the chairman. I want to thank the chairman not only for yielding time, but much, much more importantly, I want to thank him for the extraordinary work he does on behalf of the armed forces and for its veterans. He is tireless in his advocacy of veterans' interests. At every meeting that we have, I meet with him every Wednesday in the chairman's meeting, always speaking up about how we need to continue our focus on the needs of our veterans who served our country so heroically, whether they went overseas or not. And some of the veterans that we're talking about today were not overseas when they contracted a disease or an illness as a result of toxic substances. They were here in America. There's a poet who says they also serve who stand and wait, ready to serve, ready to be deployed to the point of the spear. Mr. Speaker, you and I are old enough, I don't want to be too harsh on the Speaker, but to remember the song, "When Johnny Comes Marching Home Again, Hooray, Hooray." The boys will shout, the girls will cheer, and the women, they will all turn out. One of the problems we've seen, though, after that cheering, after that parade, after that exultation, memories are short. And as time goes by, some of our veterans, sadly, tragically, and wrongfully have been forgotten. This bill says we do not forget. This bill says we will be there for you. And yes, we will be there even if there's a substantial cost to it. And this is a defense cost. In my view, the veterans' cost ought to be in the defense budget, and we ought to be there because That is what we're all enthusiastic about spending money on. And veterans need to be and are our first priority. So I want to thank the chairman for his focus and for his action. He has long been a champion of our veterans and their well-being. I also want to thank Representative Ruiz and Representative Luria, who is sitting here with us, who have worked very hard on this legislation. Ms. Luria from Virginia, retired commander in the United States Navy, commanded a ship, she and her husband. Dr. Ruiz, who has been on the front line of illness, the front line as an emergency physician, and knows full well the toxic effects, or may I say the effects of toxic material, to the well-being, psychological and physical, of individuals. And I thank Dr. Ruiz and Commander Luria for their work on this bill. Our veterans served with honor and routinely went above and beyond the call of duty in their defense of our nation. Many of them risked their lives, not everybody. There were some that were support, without whom those at the point of the spear could not have been successful. We have a responsibility, Mr. Speaker, a moral responsibility to care for our veterans when they return home and ensure that they receive the treatment they deserve. When we send our service members to war, when we recruit them, when we put them in a position by order, and they become ill because of where they are, because of either negligent or unknowing actions, unknowing to the extent we don't know the adverse effects that they caused. Whatever the situation, a soldier's exposure is our responsibility. To burn pits and other toxic substances during their service has been shown to be connected to a greatly increased risk of cancer and respiratory diseases. There's no doubt about that. The legislation before us would expand veterans' health care access and benefits to address the effects of those toxic exposures that occurred during their military service. Mr. Speaker, you and I both know we asked our veterans to go to battle for America, and they answered the call. When they return home, veterans should not have to go to battle against red tape to receive the medical treatment and benefits they have earned through their service. They ought to be able to access care for the physical and mental wounds they carry without impediment or delay. All of us have gotten cases where there have been weeks, months, years that veterans have waited for benefits that they deserve under law and as a moral responsibility of our government. We thank our veterans for their service. As I said, we cheer and shout and turn out. But this is our responsibility. This is not about cheering or shouting. This is about doing what we ought to do for those who were injured in the defense of our nation and our freedom. This is our opportunity to keep our promise to put our veterans first and truly give them our highest respect. Again, I thank my friend, Chairman Takano. I thank all the members of the Veterans Committee and all those veterans who don't forget those who come after them. I thank Mr. Takano for his leadership and urge my colleagues from both sides of the aisle to join in passing this bill with a strong bipartisan support. Our president talked about bipartisanship. I talked to Mr. Scalise about being the loyal opposition. Not loyal to Democrats or Democrat leaders, but loyal to our country. And being loyal to our country means being loyal to those who served and preserved the freedoms that we enjoy. This home of the free and land of the brave. I think it's the opposite way around, but we get the point. Brave and free go together. Let us not forget. Let's pass this bill. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Anyone who has served or has a loved one who serves, like I have and do, knows the cost of war, good and well. Veterans pay taxes too. Veterans also have children and grandchildren that they don't want to burden with debt. The PACT Act cost more than the combined discretionary budgets of 9 cabinet-level departments: Transportation, Commerce, Homeland Security, State, HUD, Interior, Justice, Energy, and Labor. And we shouldn't dismiss those massive costs so easily. Just as we have a moral responsibility to care for our veterans, we have a moral responsibility to understand the real-world consequences that we can already see in skyrocketing inflation and national debt. Congress should have to pay our bills just like our constituents do. And I'm not downplaying the importance of benefits. Getting the Health Care for Burn Pit Veterans Act signed into law may be the first step in this fight, but it would be a life-saving one. It does no good to have benefits if you're not alive to have them. Republicans invited Jim Price, a toxic exposed veteran and widower of one, to testify, and he said it is better, he says it better than I could. In Jim's word, benefits mean nothing if you are no longer alive. Chairman Takano acknowledged last week that he has not even started talking to the Senate about a compromise on this bill. That means we are months away from a deal if we can even find one. Meanwhile, veterans could receive life-saving health care now. Some veterans don't have that long to wait. They need that health care now. I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my good friend who serves as chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations for the Veterans Affairs Committee, the gentleman from New Hampshire, Mr. Pappas.
Gentleman from New Hampshire is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chairman Takano, for yielding and for your leadership on this issue, which answers the call of our nation's veterans, their advocates, and our veteran service organizations. I rise in support of the Honoring Our PACT Act, which makes good on this nation's promise to veterans. It's well past the time that we address the impacts of toxic exposure that have been endured by members of our military, and I'm glad that we're taking meaningful, comprehensive action today. I'm also pleased that this legislation includes a bill that I introduced, the PFAS Registry Act. PFAS chemicals have contaminated the environment and drinking water sources of hundreds of military bases across the country, including Pease Air Force Base in my district. These forever chemicals persist in the environment and the body and are linked to serious health conditions, including cancer. This provision will give military service members and veterans access to health information, research updates, and other resources to help protect public health and provide relief to those who have been exposed to PFAS. The Honoring Our PACT Act will help veterans already suffering from the impacts of toxic exposure, and we also must do more to reduce the risk that more service members will be exposed. That's why I've also submitted an amendment that will require our government to proactively raise awareness of the dangers of toxic exposure to active duty personnel. These provisions will require DoD and VA to create a strategy for awareness and prevention that will protect active duty service members from harm and save lives. Our men and women in uniform already face numerous threats to life and limb for their service. We must minimize risks that environmental and toxic hazards pose and provide the care, benefits, and support that these veterans have earned. It's our solemn responsibility. So I urge swift passage of my amendment as well as the underlying legislation, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa.
Thank you. Section 706 comes from H.R. 6482, which was referred to the Judiciary Committee, not the VA Committee. H.R. 6482 has not gone through the regular order of this Congress. This is another blatant example of the Democrat majority pushing through legislation without careful consideration of the impact it may have on the federal government. Moreover, this provision is a departure from past precedent because it would allow veterans to sue the United States for a disability incurred in military service. This type of change would not simply be airdropped into a bill without careful consideration within this committee. The VA estimates that the PACT Act will cause an unprecedented backlog of over 1.5 million disability claims. This will lead to longer wait times for veterans and put a strain on VBA resources and personnel. An increase in claims decisions is likely to result in an increase in appeals, which will add to the appeals backlog. All veterans, not just toxic exposed veterans, will be forced to wait months or years for a final decision on their disability claim or appeal. This is a big risk to take when there is little to no science backing the benefits expansion under this bill. And our moral responsibility, what will I say to the veterans in my district who could get health care now if we refuse to consider a bill that will pass? I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. The House will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, messages from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed S. 3600, an act to improve the cybersecurity of the federal government and for other purposes, in which concurrence of the House is requested.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my good friend and co-sponsor of H.R. 3967. She's the chairwoman of the chair of the Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs Subcommittee, and also a veteran herself and former commander of a naval surface ship, Ms. Luria from Virginia.
Gentlewoman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Takano. And Mr. Speaker, as a 20-year veteran myself, it's an honor to stand before you today. I would say that the urgency of what our veterans are facing should not be lost on this body. Autoimmune disorders, cancer, chronic disease, respiratory issues, infertility, and organ failure are just a few in a lengthy list of conditions associated with toxins during military service. Why should our veterans who risk their lives on the battlefield now have to battle for their health care when they return home? There should be no question of our commitment to the veterans who voluntarily served our nation without hesitation. This body should not hesitate to pass this legislation, the Honoring Our PACT Act. I'm proud to serve a district that has such a strong military and veterans presence. Nearly 1 out of every 6 people in Virginia's 2nd Congressional District is a veteran, and even more are their family members. Many of those veterans come from the Gulf War era, with 42% of them having served in the post-9/11 era. My presence at this podium today reconfirms my unwavering commitment to all of our constituents who depend on the passage of this legislation to get the health care that they deserve from toxic exposure. Let me be clear, veterans have earned the right to accessible VA health care. As such, the choice is clear that we need to pass the Honoring Our PACT Act. Our work on this vital legislation has been bipartisan, and it incorporates 2 bills that I've introduced. The Covenant Act, which recognized the toxic exposure of so many of our veterans and established their eligibility for health care. Furthermore, we've introduced in this legislation a provision that brings the VA healthcare notifications into the 21st century, allowing the Secretary of the VA to notify our veterans of their disability determinations electronically, something that is long overdue and has been coordinated with and requested by the Secretary of the VA. Let me say again that as a 20-year veteran myself, I support this legislation, and I want to get this health care to all of those veterans who've served and who desperately need it, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How much time remaining do I have?
The gentlewoman has 18 minutes remaining.
Thank you. The benefits provided under this bill have little to no scientific basis. For example, in 2020, the National Academies reviewed 11 of the 24 burn pit-related conditions in the bill, but could not establish a link between exposure to burn pits and those 11 conditions. The other 13 conditions were not reviewed, which further proves the point that more research is needed. It is not fair to provide benefits to select veterans under this bill while telling other veterans to wait for the science. Instead, there needs to be a fair and consistent process to decide if there is enough evidence supporting the extension of benefits to a condition that may be linked to toxic exposure. This bill sets a dangerous precedent that we cannot afford to maintain for the next group of toxic exposure veterans wanting benefits with no scientific support. And may I also add that veterans need not be in a battle for health care if we pass today the Health Care for Burn Pit Veterans Act, which is already passed in the Senate. We have received zero assurance from the VA that the PACT Act can be implemented without disrupting services to veterans. I hear every day from veterans who cannot get care in a timely manner through the VA right now. The PACT Act would make millions more veterans eligible for care through the same system, much more than the Health Care for Veterans Burn Pit Act would, and of course, that will have implications for access. Even VA's own providers have expressed concern about the impact and influx of new patients without accommodations and resources will have clogging up an already overburdened system. I reserve.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time remains?
Gentleman has 15.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my good friend who serves as chair of the Subcommittee on Technology Modernization on the Veterans Affairs Committee, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Mervan.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Takano, for the time. I am proud to rise today in support of honoring our PACT Act. Respectfully, the impact of this piece of legislation will be veterans receive world-class health care. As I meet with veterans and veteran groups from Northwest Indiana, I continue to be grateful every day for their selfless service and sacrifice by our veterans and their families. Just yesterday, less than 24 hours ago, a veteran from representing the DAV came to me who had 2 forms of cancer, who was advocating not only for himself, but other veterans to make sure they received the care and the necessity of care that they deserve. As we have a responsibility to ensure that all veterans receive world-class health care when they return home from protecting our freedoms and defending our democracy, I commend Chairman Takano for his consistent advocacy and leadership to bring this measure to the floor today. I appreciate the announcement yesterday that the VA will process claims for toxic exposed veterans with certain rare respiratory cancers. More must be done. I encourage all my colleagues to vote for the Honoring Our PACT Act so that a regular and transparent process is established to ensure that all issues facing toxic exposed veterans are comprehensively addressed. And as I opened, the impact of this legislation is that veterans receive the world-class health care they deserve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa.
Thank you. I applaud the VA for initiating a review of these 9 rare cancers to determine if they are linked to airborne hazard exposure while deployed. I'm looking forward to hearing about the VHA's research, which supported the expansion of benefits to these Gulf War and post-9/11 veterans. Likewise, I am interested in learning more about the number of veterans who would be impacted by this decision and the effect it will have on the VA. However, these 9 cancers are only a subset of the conditions included in Chairman Takano's bill. I believe more scientific research is needed to determine if additional disabilities are linked to airborne hazard exposure. Both the majority and the minority want world-class health care for our veterans, and thus it underscores our concern with this bill. I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, now I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my good friend and actually neighbor in California, someone who has authored a great big section of this bill on our presumptives, the House Veterans Affairs Committee, where he's an active member on the Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs Committee, the gentleman from California, my friend, Dr. Ruiz.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
As we stand here right now, our service members have returned home from the battlefield only to become delayed casualties of war due to their battlefield exposure to toxic burn pits. My constituents, Jennifer Kepner and Alejandro Camacho, both developed cancers from the burn pit toxic smoke containing carcinogens they breathe day in and day out while serving our country. Jen Kepner died from pancreatic cancer, and Alejandro Camacho suffers from testicular cancer. Let me repeat that. They got sick because they were exposed to burn pits, toxic smoke while doing their duty for our country. To make matters worse, both Jennifer and Alejandro were turned down when applying for benefits because the VA said that there wasn't enough evidence to link their illness to their service. To not give our veterans the proper care and benefits they earned and rightly deserve is a dereliction of our nation's duty. That is why I introduced the Presumptive Benefits for Warfighters Exposed to Burn Pits and Other Toxics Act. It would create a presumption of service connection for 23 illnesses, including cancers related to services near burn pits, and it has been included in the Honoring Our PACT Act. My bill is the very soul of the Honoring Our PACT Act. It will take the burden off of our veterans to prove that they are sick as a result of their service by presuming the reason they were diagnosed with this illness is because of their service near burn pits. Now is the time to fix this, and anything short of including all 23 of these illnesses is not good enough. The Healthcare for Burn Pits Veterans Act is not good enough. It will shortchange our veterans. It's like telling a pneumonia patient who needs antibiotics for the cure that, hey, listen, let's just give you the Tylenol, call it the day, and we've taken care of the patient. That is a medical negligence, and that is not what we're going to do to our veterans. We cannot have another Agent Orange in our generation and delay until dead, as our Vietnam veterans have said. So I urge my colleagues to support passage of this life-saving bipartisan bill. I urge them to stop the medical negligence, the dereliction of duty, to come together as a country and do what's right because the science is there. It's not a secret. Carcinogens cause cancer. Burn pit smoke have carcinogens. Our burn pits veterans are delayed casualties from cancers.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa.
The veterans who are sick may not be able to get benefits immediately under this bill, since they will be waiting for the VA to process their claims during a 1.5 million claim backlog. There's also no guarantee VA will get it right the first time. The VA does not have a great track record of accurately processing claims while working to address a massive backlog. For example, during the Obama administration, VA took shortcuts to artificially reduce the backlog, such as the Provisional Denial Program. We should be focused on getting them the care they need now to recover while continuing to work on the best path forward to other benefits. Additionally, without a clear path forward in the Senate on the PACT Act, veterans will continue to wait while Congress works to get it right. The revisions to the presumptive framework in Title II were unveiled less than 2 weeks ago. We have not had a chance to discuss these changes publicly with stakeholders and VA. As such, it is unclear if the changes made by Rules Committee print version would improve or hinder VA's efforts to establish a consistent scientific process for deciding when to extend benefits based on toxic exposure. And by doing so, as my colleague suggests, we may, in fact, not go down a pathway determining why a veteran is ill and what other exposures may have caused their illness. I believe more time is needed to refine the presumptive framework in this bill to ensure that veterans will receive a fair look at which conditions are linked to toxic exposure. We can pass the Healthcare for Burn Pit Veterans Act now as the first step to get these veterans the health care that they need as we continue to develop a bipartisan, bicameral way forward on the presumptive framework. I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'd like to yield 1 minute to my very good friend who serves as a subcommittee chair on the Appropriations Committee and also a former member of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Chairman Sanford Bishop.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the chairman for yielding. And, Mr. Speaker, I rise to support the Honor Our PACT Act, which will ensure that veterans who've been exposed to toxic substances, materials, or environments during their military service, particularly toxic burn pits and Agent Orange, will receive the care and benefits they deserve. Exposure to these toxins has led to devastating health conditions suffered by veterans, including neurological disorders, pulmonary diseases, and forms of cancer and other conditions. In the past, the government has been too slow to recognize the link between exposure to toxic substances and the medical problems that veterans have dealt with when they returned home. As a result, veterans and their families have been denied benefits and much-needed disability compensation to deal with the health effects of these toxins. The Honoring Our PACT Act will correct these errors and renew our solemn commitment to our nation's veterans. I urge my colleagues to support the Honoring Our PACT Act to ensure that our country fulfills Abraham Lincoln's promise to care for him and her who shall have borne the burden. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa.
Thank you. The concerns the minority had with this bill were laid out during the markup of the PACT Act, as well as the roundtable last month. We did not see the revised text until it was published by the Rules Committee. At the ranking member's direction, the minority staff were willing to work through these concerns with your staff, line by line, but this was rebuffed. The minority staff was also told that any proposed changes to the scope of the bill would not be accepted. It is clear that the majority was not willing to address our concerns with this bill. I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 1 minute to my very good friend who serves on the Educational Labor Committee, a member of the Select Committee on Intelligence, and is a subcommittee chair on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I proudly represent what's known as Military City, USA, San Antonio, Texas, the home to hundreds, if not thousands, of veterans who, like others across the country, were exposed to open-air burn pits, whose lives, some of them, have been ruined. And for some, it's cost them their life. And we have to stand up for our veterans the way they stood up for our country when they were on active duty. Yet what I keep hearing from Republicans is that there's not enough information. There's not enough money. Mr. Speaker, how often do you hear people around here ask whether it's too expensive to buy a tank, whether it's too expensive to buy a jet or an aircraft carrier? Yet when it comes to our men and women in uniform who go risk their lives on behalf of our countries and our allies, the question coming from Republicans is whether it's too expensive. Why don't you just tell them that it's too goddamn expensive to save their lives? Why don't you tell them that they're not worth the money? Because what you're saying is that you want tax cuts for billionaires and cancer for veterans. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa.
The question from Republicans is why not pass a bill that has already passed the Senate that would give access to life-saving health care to our veterans now? I reserve.
Gentlewoman from Iowa reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to my very good friend who serves on the Education and Labor Committee with me and as the subcommittee chair on the Agriculture Committee, the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes.
Gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to urge my colleagues to support the Honoring Our PACT Act, which upholds the promise we made to service members that we would care for them if they became sick or wounded while fighting to protect this country. This legislation recognizes the full range of military toxic exposures that service members have faced. This monumental package also includes my bill, the Palomares Veterans Act, which would remove barriers to benefits and compensation for those veterans who responded to one of the largest nuclear disasters in history. Over 55 years ago, a B-52 bomber collided with aircraft over the Spanish village of Palomares, creating radiation exposure in more than 1,600 U.S. airmen who had no protection when they responded to the crash. Decades later, many of these airmen are suffering and dying from health conditions that likely came from radioactive material. But the VA still does not count Palomares as a radiation risk event or provide these veterans with benefits or disability. My bill and the Honoring Our PACT Act would address this, ensuring these veterans get the health care and benefits they deserve and ensuring their surviving spouses and children are eligible for benefits. The job of Congress is to appropriate funds, yet whenever we want to help people, my Republican colleagues say no.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
If we're not willing to spend on veterans, what are we willing
Gentlewoman's time has
to spend
expired.
on?
Gentleman from
With
California.
that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you.
Gentleman reserves.
Reserve.
Gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized. Reserves. Gentleman from California.
At this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my good friend who's a valued member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, serving on the Subcommittee on Health, the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Frankel.
Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and your great leadership. Mr. Speaker, I'm blessed. My son, Ben, a Marine War veteran, he returned safely from tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's now a small business owner. He's even given me 2 beautiful grandsons. And listen, not every family is as lucky. Our service men and women put their lives on the line for our nation, and yet for too long, countless veterans have unknowingly been exposed to environmental hazards and toxic waste like burn pits during their duty. And then they come back home with long-term health impacts like cancer, infertility, and breathing issues. Mr. Speaker, they deserve better. We owe them better. And here's the thing. If we're willing to send our troops to war, we must also be willing to care for their health upon return. And this includes the 80,000 veterans in my home area, Palm Beach County. It's time for Congress to honor this commitment and pass the Honoring Our PACT Act to provide access to VA health care to millions of veterans exposed to toxic substances. The best way to thank our veterans for their service is with action. I urge my colleagues to pass this important bill, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves.
Mr. Speaker, may I just ask how much time remains?
Gentleman has 7.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa.
Republicans agree with Democrats about how important it is to help veterans suffering from toxic exposure. However, there is nothing bipartisan about how the majority has gone about this. The majority has consistently refused to meaningfully communicate with us on this bill. We are seeing similar refusal to work together in good faith on other fronts as well. This is the 3rd controversial veterans bill that has gone before this rules this year alone. In 2017, when this committee had a Republican chairman, the New York Times called the VA committee the most bipartisan in Congress. That is not the case in the House anymore, not since the Democrat majority took charge. I reserve.
Gentlewoman from Iowa reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 1 minute to my very good friend who serves on the House Appropriations Committee, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Mang.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise today in favor of H.R. 3967, honoring our PACT Act, authored by my friend and esteemed colleague, Chairman Takano. This important bill includes the text of my bill, the Mark Takai Atomic Veterans Healthcare Parity Act, named after our dear late friend and colleague, Representative Mark Takai. H.R. 3967 would permit veterans who participated in the nuclear cleanup of Enewetak Atoll in the Western Pacific to be treated as radiation-exposed veterans and receive service-connected compensation benefits. Current law only covers service members who participated in active nuclear tests and not those who participated in the cleanup. With the passage of this bill, Congress will finally right this wrong. Once again, I want to thank Chairman Mark Takano for his tremendous leadership on this legislation, and I urge my colleagues to vote for the passage of H.R. 3967. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentlewoman from Iowa reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 1 minute to my good friend who serves on the Financial Services Committee and the Natural Resources Committee, the gentleman from Guam, Mr. San Nicolas.
Gentleman from Guam is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Imagine a system that frustrates you being weaponized in order to deny you the care that you're entitled to, or that you should be entitled to in this country. That's what we do when we say that the inefficiencies of the VA system is reason for us to not pass this bill. This bill is going to do so much good for veterans who deserve it, and it's going to do so much good for particular veterans who served on Guam and were exposed to Agent Orange. It's the only bill right now, Mr. Speaker, that's going to get that done. The late Lonnie Kilpatrick died from his exposures to Agent Orange, and my bipartisan colleague Gus Bilirakis and I introduced a bill to address that exposure. And this legislation that we're talking about today, the Honoring Our PACT Act, will get that done. Let's not weaponize the frustrations of the VA to prevent those kind of solutions. Let's get this done for our veterans. It's about time. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
And yields back. The gentleman from California reserves. The gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentlewoman from Iowa reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'd like to yield 2.5 minutes to my good friend and colleague from the state of California, the author of the provisions on the 23 presumptions, Dr. Ruiz.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. I've been hearing these arguments or these pleads that our colleagues on the other side agree with the sentiment, that they agree that they want to take care of this. Well, those are just words. Whether they agree will be demonstrated by their vote. Those are actions. I'm hearing the same excuses that our Vietnam veterans heard when they were dying from Agent Orange and pleading for help. The excuse of the science is not there. We need more time. Oh, it costs too much. Well, listen here, the science is there. As a medical professional, I reviewed the science. The scientific studies were flawed. They did not ask the right questions, and there is enough evidence from other extrapolated data that shows that carcinogens can cause cancer, that heavy toxic metals in your lungs can cause pulmonary fibrosis. And we got to make sure that if the burn pits are illegal in the United States, they should be illegal everywhere else because of this science. Then we hear we need more time. Well, look, it's taken us years to get to this point. And I want them to ask the widows of Jen Kepner and all the veterans, the thousands of widows and sons and daughters who lost their parents, if they need more time. To them, it's too late, and we need to act now. And this is reminiscent to the notion that our Vietnam veterans say that what they want to do is delay till dead. Delay until they're dead, and we cannot allow that to happen. Then the next is it costs too much. Well, that's a value statement. That is a value statement. And to us, valuing the lives of our veterans and their family members is more important than giving billions of dollars to billionaires in a tax law that shortchanged the middle class, and their health care for the Burn Pits Act will shortchange our veterans and their widows who need the care right now because they're dying from burn pits. That is our value, and that is the value I'm pleading to the folks on the other side to join us in a bipartisan way with unity to support our veterans. So veterans are watching, they're listening, they care. Some are even listening to this with oxygen and nasal cannula, taking their medications. Some could possibly be in their hospital bed taking chemotherapy. Some are in tears because their widow and their father or mother's experiences are finally being recognized, and finally we are able to do something. They are watching, and your sympathies will be reflected in your vote. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you. The Blue Water Navy and Agent Orange were different. In 2011, the Institute of Medicine concluded that given the passage of time and lack of sampling data, there was not enough information to conclusively determine whether Blue Water Navy veterans were exposed to Agent Orange. However, we already knew what conditions were linked to Agent Orange. On the other hand, VA already presumes that certain veterans were exposed to burn pits, but it's unclear what conditions are linked to that exposure. The use of burn pits was more recent, and much of the data needed to determine whether benefits are warranted for certain conditions is still available. That is why I support, and why I urge my colleagues to support, H.R. 6659, which has already passed the Senate, which would advance research into health benefits of toxic exposures and get needed health care for those veterans now.
Woman from Iowa reserves.
I reserve.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers, and I'm prepared to close. Oh, no. On this, I have no more speakers, and I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman from Iowa prepared to close. Gentlewoman.
I'm prepared to close.
The gentlewoman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I was pleased that during last night's State of the Union that President Biden highlighted the need to address the needs of toxic exposed veterans. As I stated earlier in debate, just yesterday, VA announced it is initiating the rulemaking process to extend benefits to certain Gulf War and post-9/11 veterans who developed 9 respiratory cancers. Clearly, Secretary McDonough has the authority to provide benefits for veterans on a presumptive basis. I applaud the Secretary for exercising his authority to provide toxic exposed veterans with the earned benefits based on science and urge him to continue to do so. We should pass the Health Care for Burn Pit Veterans Act now, so we can send it straight to the President's desk immediately while we continue to work with our Senate colleagues and VA on the right solution for additional benefits. However, toxic exposed veterans will not receive health care or benefits simply by virtue of passing the PACT Act in the House today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Iowa yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, before I close, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter of support from the Independence Fund.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, as I close, give the final words on the underlying bill, the PACT Act, on my mind is a constituent, a Vietnam veteran named Zach Earp, a distant relative of the great Wyatt Earp. Zach sacrificed mightily on behalf of our country, and his body trembles today from Parkinsonism, one of the presumptives that got added during the Blue Water Navy debate. And I was happy to lead the final charge on getting the Blue Water Navy Act across the finish line. But you know what? Passage of that bill and its signature and its signing into law finally brought justice to our Vietnam veterans who served on naval surface ships in the territorial waters of Vietnam. It was 40 years late. Justice 40 years late. I vowed that this would not happen again. And to pass half measures, 1/10 measures, or 0.5% measures, which is what the minority proposes to do today, as a substitute for a comprehensive bill, is simply repeating the history of what we did to our Vietnam veterans. Burn pits are this generation of veterans' Agent Orange. My friends, we cannot repeat that history. We owe our Vietnam veterans that implicit promise that we would not repeat the history that was done to them. As for the cost, I hear the other side competing with the president. Let us send more billions of dollars to Ukraine. And I myself would support a robust response to Ukraine in terms of money. But where's that same sense of one-upmanship when it comes to taking care of the veterans here in America? The unfinished business. Racing to the finish when we can't, people are falling over each other in this chamber to get more money to Ukraine, and that's the right thing to do. But it's also the right thing to do to take care of our veterans and to finish the unfinished business. And finally, the science. I'm glad to see science is being taken so seriously by the minority after we've seen skepticism about vaccines, skepticism about climate change, and suddenly we're looking for a scientific absolutism about our veterans. My friends, the science is there. Let's get this done. Let's pass the PACT Act today with a big bipartisan vote.
Gentleman from California yields back. All time for debate has expired. Each further amendment printed in Part B of House Report 117-253, not earlier considered as part of amendments en bloc pursuant to Section 3 of House Resolution 950, shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before the question is put thereon, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It shall be in order at any time after debate for the chair of the Committee on Veterans Affairs or his designee to offer amendments en bloc consisting of further amendments printed in Part B of House Report 117-253, not earlier disposed of. Amendments en bloc shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Veterans Affairs or their respective designees, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Section 7 of House Resolution 950, I rise to offer the 23 amendments en bloc to H.R. 3967.
The clerk will designate the amendments en bloc.
En bloc consisting of amendments numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 21, 24, 25, 26, 27, and 28, printed in Part B of House Report number 117-253, offered by Mr. Takano of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 950, the gentleman from California, Mr. Takano, and the gentlewoman from Iowa, Mrs. Miller Meeks, each will control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan en bloc of amendments, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
I rise in support of the en bloc package. Many of these amendments strengthen the underlying bill. However, I wish we could have more time in committee to fully examine the impact these amendments would have on this legislation. And while I will not oppose the en bloc package, some of the included amendments are well outside the Veterans Affairs Committee's jurisdiction or may require additional work, and I must highlight these concerns. 3 of the amendments clearly impact the operations of the Department of Defense and are well outside the Department of Veterans Affairs expertise or mission. Representative Bush's Amendment 3 would necessitate that the VA review known cases of toxic exposure on military installations both in the United States and abroad. Bush Amendment 4 requires a study of health outcomes related to waste from the Manhattan Project. If anyone is going to conduct such reviews, it should be the Department of Defense, not the Department of Veterans Affairs. VA's time and resources need to be focused on meeting the needs of veterans, not on investigating activities on military bases or as part of military programs. Yet another amendment, Representative Pappas's Amendment 17, would require VA to conduct a study outside of VA's expertise and purview. This amendment would require VA to coordinate with the Department of Defense to provide training to active duty service members on toxic exposure. It is inappropriate for the VA to be involved in training active duty service members. That is entirely the DoD's purview. Finally, Representative Scallon's Amendment 24 would authorize an additional $150 million in discretionary funding for VA's Veterans Benefits Management System, ahead of an expected drastic increase in disability claims should the PACT Act be enacted. I agree with the intent. We need to make additional investments in benefits IT, but this is not the right way to do it. According to the CBO, the bill already includes funding for IT improvements. We have no plan from the VA about how various systems should be modernized and how much it will ultimately cost. The worst thing we could do is to throw money at individual systems with no coordination. Moreover, this amendment improperly earmarks $150 million for VBMS, which is a dysfunctional and flawed system. VBMS has cost over $1 billion and has been struggling since its inception 10 years ago. I'm not comfortable with spending another $150 million on it unless the VA gives us a plan explaining how it can be modernized. Moving forward, we need to work on allocating funding where it can have the most impact. Again, I support the intent and look forward to ensuring that any IT funding supports veterans in the manner intended. As I stated earlier, while I do have concerns about these 4 amendments, I will support the en bloc package and urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves the balance of her time. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 1 minute to my very good friend who serves on the Judiciary Committee and the House Oversight and Reform Committee, the gentlewoman from Missouri. 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Bush. 2 minutes.
Gentlewoman from Missouri is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chairman Takano, for your leadership on this historic legislation. St. Louis and I rise today in support of H.R. 3967, the Honoring Our PACT Act, to expand healthcare research and resources for our veterans who are far too often exposed to toxic substances, both around the world and at home in St. Louis. And this means so much to me as a nurse. I see it all the time. I am proud to put forward 4 critical amendments to this legislation to help expand racial equity and study the military's environmental impact through rigorous Department of Veterans Affairs research initiatives. My first 2 amendments ensure that VA research studies include a broader array of demographic information, including race, ethnicity, and disability status, in gathering information on the impacts of toxic exposure. Our third vital amendment ensures the VA will extend reviews of known cases of toxic exposure to military sites abroad. The Department of Defense needs to provide concrete data about the waste and pollution we are leaving in the nearly 750 military bases in over 80 countries around the world. Finally, our last amendment adds a new study to this bill to measure the harmful health consequences of Manhattan Project waste on our veterans and their families in St. Louis. If you're from North St. Louis, there is a good chance that at some point in your life, you have been exposed to toxic military waste like I have. From Westlake Landfill to Coldwater Creek, toxic military nuclear waste has been dumped in our communities, leading to rare cancers and birth defects. Our veterans worked with this waste and are still living with it. This study is just one step we're taking to care for their health and safety. I look forward to voting in support of the Honoring Our PACT Act and advancing these critical amendments that will help us to save lives. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to yield 2 minutes to my colleague from Ohio, Mr. Gibbs.
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you for yielding. I rise today, amendment number 8 in the in-block support. This amendment helps veterans and their families navigate a bureaucratic maze of the VA. And they're very frustrated lots of times that they receive medical treatment at a non-VA facility. When a veteran is admitted to a hospital or emergency department, they currently only have 3 days to notify the VA. If they fail to notify the VA in that 3-day window, any claim associated with that visit will be automatically denied. There are circumstances when getting immediate medical care outside of the VA system is the veteran's only option, especially during a medical emergency. They and their families should not have to worry about paperwork and the bureaucracy if the veteran is facing a life-threatening condition or is unable to make his or her own health care decisions. My amendment simply just lengthens that window, adds another day under that window to report the claim. And when you think about this, if you're going on an emergency basis, after you get stabilized, it might take a couple days in the hospital to get stabilized. That extra day doesn't seem like much, but it's really important because they get stabilized and they get time to sort through where they're at, and they won't. That is so important because we've helped hundreds and maybe even thousands of veterans back in Ohio, and this comes up all the time, and we fight to get their claim. And I think it's really important. Just a little bit extra time. It's really a no-brainer issue, I think. And I appreciate the chair put it in the in-block because it is really important because veterans, especially when they're at a non-veterans facility and have emergency care, shouldn't have to worry about that deadline. Just give them a little extra time. So I appreciate that, and I support amendment number 8. Thank you. I yield back.
Yields back. The gentlewoman from Iowa reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my good friend who serves as the chair of the Agriculture Committee, subcommittee chair on the Agriculture Committee and a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. Spanberger.
Thank you very much,
Gentlewoman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, my commitment to supporting veterans suffering from toxic exposures has been ironclad since I first met the late Michael Lisick, a father, a husband, a firefighter, and a veteran who died of cancer related to his exposures. And it continued when I met Gilly Jenkins, an atomic veteran from Chesterfield, Virginia, who in his 90s is still fighting for the recognition of his brothers in arms and the sacrifices that they made. And today, when I rise in support of my amendment to H.R. 3967, I am doing so inspired by William G. Collins, a veteran from Louisa County, Virginia. My amendment would require the VA to investigate the long-term health impacts of jet fuel exposures on our country's service members. Mr. Collins, a veteran from Louisa County, Virginia, is living with Parkinson's, and as a former Air Force crew fire chief, his years of constant exposure to jet fuel put him at risk. But now the VA does not recognize Mr. Collins' condition as having a service connection. Mr. Collins served honorably, and he should know that his country has his back. This amendment would bring us one step closer to ensuring that veterans like William have the health care benefits they deserve and the acknowledgement of their sacrifice. Mr. Collins says this disease has impacted my health, my economic security, and potentially my wife and I's dream of spending our last years on our beloved farm where we raised our family. Today, I urge my colleagues to support this long overdue amendment as we support all of our nation's veterans. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for your work, and Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized. Gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'd like to recognize a distinguished member of the Appropriations Committee, actually a distinguished chair, a subcommittee chair of the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Cartwright from the state of Pennsylvania.
For how long?
2 minutes.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from California, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Speaker, here's the deal. When we send our service members into harm's way, the deal is that we're going to take care of them when they get back home. It's more than a deal. It's a pact. It's something sacred. But for far too long, Congress and the VA, Department of Veterans Affairs, have been slow in acting on that pact, citing the high cost or the lack of science. The result is a disability claims benefit process that is cumbersome and places the burden on the veteran himself or herself to prove toxic exposure. I rise in support of my amendment, which streamlines this process. It helps ease the burden of the disability benefit claims process on service members and their families by, number one, requiring the Secretary of the VA to share a list of resources for toxic exposed veterans, caregivers of toxic exposed veterans, and survivors of toxic exposed vets with national veteran service organizations and other veterans groups. And number two, it requires the Secretary, the VA Secretary, to share an outreach program with those VSOs. I believe we have to take every step possible to ensure that we offer the best care to those who have served our nation. My amendment is a step forward in reaching the goal. Service members and their families should be made aware of every resource, and that includes the resources including in the Honoring Our PACT Act. I thank the chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers. I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman's prepared to close. Gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask all of my colleagues to join me in supporting these 23 amendments en bloc, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Pursuant to House Resolution 950, the previous question is ordered on the amendments en bloc offered by the gentleman from California. The question is on the amendments en bloc. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Gentleman from Arizona.
I request the yeas and nays.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings are postponed. It's now in order to consider Amendment Number 5, printed in Part B of House Report 117-253. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Iowa seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise as a designee of the gentleman from Illinois, and I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in Part B of House Report number 117-253, offered by Mrs. Miller Meeks of Iowa.
Pursuant to House Resolution 950, the gentlewoman from Iowa, Mrs. Miller Meeks, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Iowa.
Thank you. I rise today to discuss Ranking Member Boss' amendment to replace the PACT Act with the Health Care for Burn Pit Veterans Act. The Health Care for Burn Pit Veterans Act is a bipartisan legislation that has already passed in the Senate. It would expand health care for toxic exposed veterans by extending VA's enhanced combat eligibility period from 5 to 10 years. That would give post-9/11 combat veterans a decade after leaving the military to enroll in VA care without having a service-connected disability rating or a low income. Those who have been out of the military for more than a decade would be able to enroll during a 1-year open enrollment period. The bill would also improve training for VA staff on how to recognize and treat toxic exposure, research on the impact of toxic exposure, and outreach about the resources available to veterans regarding toxic exposure. CBO has estimated that the bill would cost $1 billion in discretionary funding over 10 years. That is in stark contrast to over $300 billion discretionary and mandatory cost of the PACT Act. The Health Care for Burn Pit Veterans Act would not expand compensation benefits for toxic exposed veterans. I appreciate the importance of benefits. That's why Ranking Member Bost and I remain committed to working across the aisle and Capitol to improve benefits for toxic exposed veterans. The framework that the PACT Act establishes to do that, however, is unworkable. And I am afraid the PACT Act will stall without a clear path forward in the Senate. I don't want to let perfect be the enemy of good on an issue as important as this one. I also don't want to let this Congress go by without helping veterans who are sick and dying from toxic exposure. As a veteran and as a doctor who has cared for sick and dying patients, that would be an unacceptable outcome for me. Passage of the Health Care for Burn Pit Veterans Act is a critical first step in saving the lives of veterans suffering from toxic exposure. The House should not let another day go by without sending it to the President. The stakes are too high. Behind me is a picture of Lauren Rice. She passed away from conditions she and her husband Jim believe were related to toxic exposure. Ranking Member Bost invited Jim to testify last year about Lauren's legacy. During his testimony, Jim stressed the need to provide veterans like her with VA health care. And as he said, benefits don't mean much if a veteran isn't alive to get them because they didn't get the health care they need and earned. Jim's message is an important one. Some veterans cannot afford to keep waiting for Congress to agree on a comprehensive way forward. That would be a monumental task, and we have not even started it yet. That's why the House must pass the Health Care for Veterans Act today. I hope we will. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for
Mr.
5
Speaker,
minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to the ranking member's to Ranking Member Boss' substitute offered in his absence by Representative Miller Meeks. I want to be clear about what this substitute is and what it is not. The ranking member has offered this amendment as the solution to addressing toxic exposure, but it is not that. The substitute amendment is the exact text of a Senator Tester bill, which is meant to be the first part of a three-part effort in the Senate. What Senator Tester has proposed is doing in 3 phases what we have done in the PACT Act together. Yet, my colleague from Illinois and my colleague from Iowa have taken the work of the Senate without intending to do any more. This is it. They are representing this as the complete solution, which amounts to really a bait and switch. This substitute amendment would strike the entire PACT Act and replace it with an expansion of existing health care eligibility for combat veterans from 5 to 10 years. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that this provision will impact roughly 16,000 veterans over the next 10 years. This is laudable, but let's talk about the math. Over the past 20 years, 3.5 million service members deployed to areas where they may have been exposed to toxic substances. So the ranking member's amendment would leave behind over 3.4 million veterans. This is not even a half measure, this substitute, this replacement that they offer. It's not even 1/10. It's 1/2 of 1%. A 1/2 of 1% solution compared to the comprehensive bill that we need. The policy of this amendment is something we agree on. We should enhance eligibility for combat veterans, which is why we included the language in the bill before you today. However, it only covers less than a half percentage point of the number of veterans that would be covered under PACT. My colleague is asserting that less than a half a percentage point is enough to be done and then walk away. The math does not add up, and veterans know it. And that is why over 42 veteran service organizations are supporting the PACT Act. Again, I referenced the letters previously inserted into the record. During the President's State of the Union address last night, he highlighted the importance of this topic, citing his own family's tragedy and the loss of his son, Bo, to brain cancer after his military service. He called on Congress to, quote, pass a law to make sure veterans devastated by toxic exposures in Iraq and Afghanistan finally get the benefits and comprehensive health care that they deserve, end quote. Let me repeat that. Pass a law to make sure veterans devastated by toxic exposures in Iraq and Afghanistan finally get the benefits and comprehensive health care they deserve. The BOSS substitute is far from comprehensive. In fact, it is a fraction of what our veterans have earned and deserve. It is time we honored our pact with our veterans, and that's why I implore my colleagues to reject this incremental measure and join me in supporting the only comprehensive toxic exposure legislation that delivers on our sacred promise, the PACT Act. Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have remaining?
The gentleperson has 1 minute and 15 seconds left.
Thank you. At this time, I would like to reserve my time.
The gentleperson reserves. The gentleperson from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With all due deference to my colleague, Representative Bost, Ranking Member Bost, has made it abundantly clear that this is a first step, not a last step, but an initial first step in getting veterans the health care that they need and deserve. And with that, I urge my colleagues and implore my colleagues to pass Mr. Bost's Amendment 5. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleperson yields back. The gentleperson from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, at this time I'd like to yield my remaining time to my good friend who serves on the Budget Committee and on Homeland Security Committee and as Subcommittee Chair on the Judiciary Committee, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentleperson is recognized.
I thank my distinguished friend, and I rise enthusiastically, joining the President and joining our Chairman in honoring our PACT Act, and just remind the underlying amendment by Mr. Boss, 1/2 of 1%. Do we, in this time, do our veterans, do our soldiers deserve half treatment? I don't think so. The Jackson-Lee Amendment adds to this legislation. It would add a report on the feasibility of modifying the individual longitudinal exposure record system used to register toxic exposure of military personnel to include members of the National Guard who are deployed in the United States in connection with a natural disaster without regard to duty status, and may record information regarding a suspected exposure by the National Guard to toxic substances while they're in the midst of their rescues. We know, and we thank the House Veterans Affairs Committee for recognizing and working with my staff that the National Guard is involved in toxic matters on home side. They collaborate with and support civilian authorities and traditional first responders. They're called in as a helpmate. They serve to strengthen and expand local disaster response, while the emergency services of a state or locale may have robust plans to deal with unexpected, sometimes disasters strike that overwhelm their resources. Let me just show you. They are involved in the work. This is an important amendment. I ask my colleagues to support it.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
Yield back.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to address the House and reclaim my
Time from
time.
California has expired. Has now expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 950, the previous question is ordered on the amendment offered by the gentle lady from Iowa. The question is on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for a recorded vote.
For what purpose does the gentlelady arrive?
Excuse me, Mr. Speaker, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote. Pursuant to Section 3A of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings are postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 6, printed in Part B of House Report 117-253. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California, or the gentleman from California, gentlewoman from Iowa, seek recognition? From California, I'm sorry, gentlewoman from California. For what purpose?
Over here, over here. She's over here.
Gentlewoman from California. Now I'm oriented.
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
Thank you. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in Part B of House Report number 117-253, offered by Ms. Brownlee of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 950, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Brownlee, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to offer a straightforward amendment to H.R. 3967, the Honoring Our PACT Act, which would simply ensure toxic exposed veterans have access to mammography screenings. I'd like to begin by thanking my colleague from Iowa, Congresswoman Miller Meeks, for co-authoring this amendment, which is based on her outstanding bill. As chair of the House Veteran Affairs Subcommittee on Health, I very much want to see the gentle lady's good bill advance, which is why I am offering this amendment today. As you know, the conditions related to toxic exposure manifest themselves in many ways and on many different timelines. The incidence rate of breast cancer in women veterans is 20 to 40% higher than the incidence rate of breast cancer among non-veteran women. From 2000 to 2015, the VA saw the number of women diagnosed with breast cancer increase by 5 times for women ages 45 to 65. This is partly due to better screening, but still more can be done, particularly related to those who have been exposed to toxic substances. Ensuring that veterans have access to life-saving screening for breast cancer cannot depend on the time after separation from the military and must simply depend on whether a veteran served in a place where they were exposed to toxics. This amendment based on the Service Act, directs the Department of Veteran Affairs to provide mammogram screenings for female veterans who served in areas associated with burn pits and other toxic exposure. It also directs the VA to submit a report to both the Senate and House Veteran Affairs Committee 2 years after enactment that compare the instances of breast cancer among members of the armed forces. Women veterans who serve in areas with high toxic exposure should not have to wait until they start showing symptoms or reach a certain age to access preventive mammography screenings. This is why I am proud to join Congresswoman Miller Meeks in offering this life-saving amendment. And with that, I reserve my time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentlewoman, for what purpose does the gentlewoman from Iowa seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I claim time in opposition, although I'm not opposed.
Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I was pleased to introduce this amendment alongside my colleague, Congresswoman Julia Brownlee from California. This amendment is based on our bill, H.R. 4794, the Making Advances in Mammography and Medical Options for Veterans Act. It would ensure that toxic exposed veterans can access mammography screenings through the VA healthcare system. As a doctor, I know how very important preventive care is. Early detection of cancer or other serious conditions can be life-saving for patients. Veterans deserve the very highest quality care that we can offer them, and that certainly includes timely access to mammograms, particularly for the growing number of women who are volunteering to serve in our armed forces. I thank Congresswoman Brownlee for working with me on this amendment. I am glad that it was made in order, and I urge all of my colleagues to support that. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves the balance of her time. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, how much time is remaining on each side?
Gentlelady has 2.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much. I yield 2 minutes to the great chair of the Veteran Affairs Committee who has worked diligently on this very, very important bill.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my colleague, the chair of the Subcommittee on Health. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Brownlee-Miller-Meeks amendment. Women who have served in the military are 20 to 40% more likely to develop breast cancer than women who have never served. It is believed that it is due to exposure to radiation and other carcinogens while serving. It is therefore critical that VA ensure all veterans who served in locations associated with toxic exposure have access to prompt, high-quality breast imaging services to detect breast cancer early. This amendment would ensure just that. Any eligible veteran who is deployed and exposed to burn pits or airborne hazards would be eligible for mammography screening by VA. These screenings will save lives. Furthermore, it requires VA to submit a report to Congress on the rates of breast cancer among those veterans deployed to such toxic environments and compare those rates against their veteran peers who were not exposed, as well as the civilian population. Mr. Speaker, I urge all my colleagues to support this common sense amendment, and I thank you and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from California reserves. Gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Iowa yields back. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In closing, I just urge all members to support mammography screenings for toxic exposed veterans and vote yes on this amendment. And I would also like to say that we must pass this bill today, a bill that will finally bring justice to our veterans and provide our commitment and promise that we made to our veterans who served our country, both men and women. So this bill is long overdue. Men and women sign up for the armed forces. They know they may have to put their life on the line. They did not know that they may die of toxic exposures. This bill is long overdue. We need a yes vote on the amendment and a yes vote on the underlying bill. And with that, I yield back.
The previous question is ordered on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. The question is on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment. And the gentleman from Texas, for what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Speaker, person, I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings are postponed. Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of H.R. 3967 is postponed.